everybody, my name is Hollis. Welcome to my channel, Watercolor with me. Today I'm going to be going over a little bit on how to do a galaxy watercolor print or a galaxy watercolor painting. This is one I did in 2018. I used a mix of techniques here, but today we're going to focus on kind of doing the background aspect of a space or galaxy painting. This is going to transfer over to like night scenes, or it's going to be a similar technique if you are doing a almost like an aurora borealis or northern lights kind of painting. So let's jump right in. So first thing I'm going to do is I have my water here. I have my paints all ready to go and set up. In my palette today I have ultramarine and raw umber. Yeah, raw umber. I have permanent scarlet. I have a really nice vibrant red, a little bit of a cooler blue, bright yellow, yellow ochre, and then opera red as well. I'm just going to go ahead and take my 1-inch Hockey brush, which holds on to a lot of water, and I'm just going to dip it in, get it nice and wet, make sure I don't have paint on it, and I'm just going to wet this entire surface. So when you are doing like a galaxy painting or a kind of a space theme, you want to make sure that you are leaving some of the white in the paper behind, because that's what's going to give you that brightness. So we might just do some really light tinges, but we're going to kind of make it a little random with the colors. So with my palette, I'm going to go in with, this is kind of like a Chinese or Japanese calligraphy brush. I'm not 100% sure which. It holds onto a lot of water. I want a lot of wet paint on this, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to use this kind of lighter blue, and I'm actually going to add a little green to it to make it more of like a teal turquoise color, and I'm just going to go right on, and I'm just barely touching the paper with this, and I'm just kind of depositing a little bit of color, kind of letting it do its own thing, go where it wants to go. At least for this first layer, I'm going to be doing a couple different layers. I'm mostly going to be going ahead and adding my colors ever so gently, and then I'll kind of pick and choose where I want it to be darker later. So going in real nice. Some areas I might go a little bit more vibrant, like here. One, just because I got a little more paint on my brush than I wanted to. But if that happens, especially in this stage, because the paper is still wet, you can just go in and swoop it around with more water or a different brush stroke. I got my handy dandy towel here, and I'm gonna add some more of that blue. Just kind of being real loose with it. Maybe it's turning more green, that's fine. Just kind of picking some different directions and colors. You want to have depth and color variation and deposited pigment variation for this kind of a painting. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do just some more like really bright yellow here. Kind of almost toxic looking. I love that color. Just going to do some of that. And I'm just kind of going all over, and I don't care if the colors bleed into each other at all at this stage. I might go in with a little bit of a blue as well. It's not quite as vibrant as I want, but that's okay. I'm going to go back in with this pink. I'm actually going to mix it with some of this blue and kind of create a nice kind of purple. Not quite a fuchsia, but just a little bit of a more vibrant kind of neon-y purple. And I have some purple paint, so I could just use those, but I kind of like to challenge my color palette a little bit. And because of how wet this was and how solid this paint was, you can see that it's kind of settling in here. I'm hoping that's doing what I need it to do. But, so this is the kind of the first stage. And I'm going to go in, because I'm going to be working this layer quite a bit. I'm just going to go in and dab up some excess paint and water. I'm not too worried about it pulling everything up. Kind of like that textural difference. I'm going to go in with a different brush here. This guy is a size 10. It's from Winsor & Newton. It's a round brush. They call it a round. It holds onto a lot of water. This one's a natural fiber brush. I really enjoy using it. Just going in my palette here, grabbing some more colors, gonna go for some greens. I think I'm feeling like this guy needs some greens. So I'm gonna go here where I put some yellow down earlier. I'm gonna add some green down here. You can kind of see here, this paper's a little drier because I dabbed it with my paper towel. So I'm gonna just go ahead and soften that edge a little bit more by adding more water to it. I'm just gonna play around. This pink was wet when I put it on my palette, so it's not as dry as the other paints are. So it's kind of throwing me for a loop when I'm putting it on. Go ahead and throw some more pink in there. Have a little bit of something else in that color. Well, here that's neutralizing it just a little bit, so it's not quite as hot pink like it is there. And then I'm gonna go ahead and get some more of this blue, tealy, turquoisey color. I have a lot of green overflow, so we'll see how well this goes. There we go. Just kind of playing with that. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can either just start jumping in to adding your darker layers, or you can just keep slowly layering some more colors over and intermingling the washes here. I'm going to do a little more intermingling play here before I get started on the next step. I have a little bit more yellow. It's kind of fun to have some really vibrant pops in different areas, because you can always tone it down with the darker color later. I don't know if you can hear that weird noise, but that is my dog scratching. She's very loud. Zoe. And she happens to be hitting the curtain, which makes it sound like a drum. Alright. Going back in here, grabbing my coffee. Alright. So this is kind of setting up and drawing. I added a few more colors here. I have kind of purposely left this area lighter in this top corner here. I'm not really planning on adding a ton of pigment there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go in to my palette. I'm going to mix a ton of almost like a bluish, a really dark blue. So if you have a paint color that is like more of a navy blue or like a purpley blue, go ahead and use that. I am just showing how to use it with just a couple colors here. So I'm mixing a lot of ultramarine and a lot of that raw umber. I think in some of my other videos I was saying I was using burnt umber. It's actually raw umber. And so that creates this nice kind of neutral gray. But if I add a little bit more red to it, it creates a more, almost a deeper hue. And if I add a little pink to it, that's going to kind of change it up. I prefer, when I'm doing a night sky, especially when I'm just doing a strict galaxy, I do prefer to use a little bit more of a purple undertone or a blue undertone than just a straight black. And I think it just adds a little something to it. So one thing you can do if you really want specific areas to stay really light is you can let this whole layer dry completely and then go in with some resist and add some dots to it. If you want areas to stay completely pure white for stars, you can do the same thing. I'm just going to kind of wipe this edge down here. So I'm going to start going in with this, and the paper is still a little bit wet, so I'm being very careful as to where I start placing my darker pigment, because I want to make sure it's mixing a little bit into that the fun colors, but it's still not overflowing too much. So, and with this, you can do as much of this darker color as you want. Because the paper is still pretty wet, this first layer is going to dry a little on the lighter side, and I'm okay with that. I don't want to go too strong too fast with this. I'm going to go ahead and dark in. Just kind of play around with it. Sometimes when I paint, I will paint on a board that is separate from my actual desktop tabletop here. And so I can kind of shift it and make the water pool in different ways. I'm not doing that right now for these videos because I haven't quite figured out how I want to do that yet. But so basically we're just going in and covering up a lot of fun colors right now. And that's okay. That's kind of what I want to do. And we kind of got a little bit more brown here than the blue in this run, which is fine. Do a little bit there, cover some of that up, and I'm just kind of being real loose with this. I'm not, no real game plan, no real initiative on this guy. Initiative, that's not the right word, whatever. Go ahead and you're basically just gonna fill it up. And this is a pretty big paper. This is, I think, a little bit over an 8x10 for this guy here. So I am just going in, trying to fill up as much can. You can see here that these are not quite fading the way I want them to. So what I'm going to do is clean my brush off completely, dry it off a little bit, and I'm just going to run it along that edge, and you see how that kind of creates this nice soft edge now. It's kind of going towards it. So that is a way, if you realize that you went into a dry spot, that you can kind of soften that edge. Because we'll be doing that a lot in the next layer. But right now, I'm just going in, still filling, doing a lot of blues, bluish gray, and a little more pink now. Continuing on. Clean this brush off because we have that dry spot again. And if you go a little overboard, like I did here, just go in with a dry paper towel. You can pull up some of that other pigment on top. Go back in with a slightly damp brush, clean things up. Go in with like a dry, thirsty brush where you just kind of pull all that water off, and you can just kind of go back in and reveal colors if you feel like you went too far. Because when it's in this wet state, it's just going to keep spreading into itself. So you really have to keep an eye on it. Maybe add a little bit more vibrancy here and there if you really want it to be super bright looking. Go with a little bit of water, and that's going to push back into itself. There. Still going to leave this area. Areas that I want to make sure stay really vibrant, I am not putting a ton of paint on right yet, here especially. So I'm just going to do that, and then I'm going to grab my hairdryer here after I finish getting this base layer, and that's going to just speed up the process, make sure everything dries all the way. I'll do you a favor and turn down the volume for that when that goes. Okay, so we got a good base layer down. Time to dry. So, be right back. Oh, just kidding. I want to soften that spot right there. Okay, this whole layer is now completely dry. I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a little bit more of my ultramarine blue to my palette, just because I am running low because I used a lot in this painting so far. As you can see, things dried. These areas got a little lighter, a little bit brighter. If you want to, at this point, you can go in and intensify some areas of color if you are feeling like you want a little bit more vibrancy in a few spots. I don't know what shade of blue this is, but I'm going to use that. Hopefully that's not a mistake. All right. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of this kind of aqua-y, vibrant green, and I'm going to just ever so slightly kind of intensify this area. So I'm just doing a really nice light wash here, and just going to basically layer a little bit more pigment on top of what's already there. It's going to get a little bit on the wet side because I didn't dry my brush off completely, but I just want that area to have a little bit more vibrancy. So for this next layer, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You can either, using a just lightly damp wide brush like this, just kind of gently go over an area, re-wet it. I'm gonna demonstrate a couple ways to do this on the same painting. Just gently re-wet that, go in with your paint, and continually do that kind of very soft and subtle build up of color like we just did on that last layer where it's really wet. The paint's going to flow into itself really nicely. I'm going a little bit more blue on this layer. And that's going to just create some really nice soft effects. If you feel like there was a little bit of a harsh edge earlier like I had there, you can just go in a little bit more with that. Go in with some dark, and it's alright to vary the color a little bit. It doesn't have to be a true blue, it can be a little bit more of a purple. It's going to add some more depth here. And I'm not going to worry about where these like thicker deposits are because it's just going to blend into itself really nicely. So you can do that to help build that up. You can water it down a little bit more, create those nice soft layers, go in, dab things up if it's getting a little carried away. So that's one way you can do this. Another way you can do this is just gently with a wet brush, no pigment on it, is kind of outline the area that you want to stay bright, and then go in with your brush and just lay that in more of a glazing method on the other drier areas. So like here, you can see as soon as it kind of hits that wall of water that I've put down, it'll bleed into that, but everywhere else it's kind of staying solid. So that's another way to do this. It just kind of depends on the effect you want. So I'm definitely going into an area that I didn't have paint on earlier here. I'm making this a little bit more of a deep purple. Kind of a purpley red, blue thing. I don't know. Mixing colors. I'm just kind of throwing that down to make it a little deeper in that area. So here I have that kind of solid wall of paint, and I want to soften it into the green up here. So I'm just going to take a nice wet brush and pull it along that edge. It's wet, but it's not dripping, and it's just going to leave a little bit of a area for that paint to spread into, and it's also just going to pick up some of that edges too, those edges too. So do that. There's a little bit, I want this to be a little softer. So going in, a little bit of a wet brush, picking all that up, and I'm using kind of a small brush for this, for how much paint I'm trying to put on the paper, so I could use a slightly bigger one, but I like the control I have with this one, and it's doing a pretty nice job of holding on to the water and everything. You can kind of see the color variations going on now. You have a little bit more of that blue, a little bit more of a neutral gray in some areas, and it's really starting to get darker and starting to come alive. Personally, I prefer wetting the whole page and then kind of going in with the paint myself, just because I really like that very subtle gradient that happens. So I'm just going to continue doing that on here. My brush isn't sopping wet, it's just like a medium amount of wetness, I guess. I'm trying to figure out the right words to describe that. I'm going to do that, and that's going to make it go a little faster as well. So this is a very similar effect that you can use for doing like a Northern Lights type painting. With a painting for like Aurora Borealis or Northern Lights, I would definitely recommend kind of tipping the page a little bit, just so you get that motion of the Northern Lights, because Northern Lights themselves, they tend to have more vertical streams coming out of them and things, if that makes sense. So while this is really good for getting the color, you don't quite get that same sense of motion that the actual Northern Lights have. And we'll do that in a future video. I'll kind of do a Northern Lights demonstration as well. Just going in, deepening colors, deepening areas, using kind of a mix of blues and brown and purple here. Really just intensifying everything. Softening some areas that need it. And while I'm adding color in some of these other areas, I am kind of keeping an eye on where my paint is bleeding into itself in a way I don't want it to. So I'm going to go in here in a second with a slightly damp rag or a slightly damp paper towel and just kind of pick up and clean up some of those edges here, because I want them to be better than they are. It's a little too blue. So like here, in this spot here, it's a little harsh. So I have a paper towel that's a little soaked. I'm just gonna gently dab in kind of a pulling motion to clean and soften that edge on that pink. And then I'm gonna go in with a nice clean brush over here, because that paint is still a little on the wet side. I'm just gonna gently coax it into some different areas by pulling that paint a little bit more. And this guy is super wet because we just put a shit ton of paint on it. A lot of water, a lot of paint. That is the way of watercolor. Alright, so we're going to go in with our hairdryer again, and I'll be nice to you guys and speed that video part up and mute the lovely sound of the hairdryer because it sucks. Let's see, girl. Alright, so as you can see where we're at right now, we've got a lot of areas that are covered up. It's definitely a lot darker. We've got a lot more colors, kind of muted, but that's making those really soft and subtle and light colors that seemed a little on the light side initially really stand out now because I have a really nice contrast with that darker shades around it. So I'm going to go on in with this and let's try it. Alright, so you can tell that now that we've done that next layer, some of the colors have lightened up just a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and go in one more time, just ever so lightly wetting this entire surface again. And we're just going to do one more final pass and add some really nice deep and dark areas. And so for this layer, I'm going to switch it up with my paints a tiny bit, and I'm going to use, I have just a nice solid dark indigo and a nice indanthrine blue that has a really nice, really rich color to it. So I'm just going to put a giant glob of those guys on my palette. And I'm just letting that paint kind of or the water gently kind of seep into the paper here. Do a little bit of a light pass this way, make sure it's nice and evenly coated, but I'm doing this really gently. I'm not trying to activate or disturb the paint layers beneath. So we're just going to do that, let it sit for a second as we mix these colors together. Oh, that's really pretty. Dark, nice dark sky blue. Love it. Love it, love it, love it. And I'm okay if I put a giant glob on my palette like I just did, because I know I'll use them in another painting in the future. So going in, and this time I'm going to be doing a little bit of a drier application. So my brush isn't going to be quite as fully loaded because I want to have a little bit more control over where I am putting this pigment down. So I'm kind of going in, I'm starting in the center parts that are the furthest away from the lightest color. if that makes sense. So right here in the middle between these, basically. And the reason I'm doing that is because I know this paint is going to spread, but I don't want it to completely run into these very beautiful, light, subtle shifts of color that we have going on. Because that helps kind of reinforce light and coming in as like a different galaxy, that kind of thing. And after we do this last layer of color, we're going to go in with some white paint. You can do this with gouache, you can do this with white ink if you have it. We're going to do a mix of technique with both kind of like a very fine tip brush and a toothbrush to create some nice like star spotter effects here. And I'm okay if this dark corner is very, very dark. I'm gonna add some brown and some red to it just to change it up. And because I want this corner super dark, I am totally fine with just mixing it right on the paper as opposed to in my palette. And as I'm going, I can tell that I didn't quite put enough water down that I wanted, so I'm going to go rinse this brush off real good. And again, using a wet, clean brush to just soften those edges so they blend nicely into each other. Because I love the soft and subtle blending of color in my watercolors. Not everybody does, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because I have a couple areas over here that I know I need to clean up with this later, so I'm going to do that. Okay, just feeling my paper, seeing how dry it is. I'm going to add a little bit more water to some areas that I know need it, which is over on this side, because I took my sweet time. Mixing up some of that brown, some of those dark blues, a little bit of purple. And you can see on the palette how much thicker this paint is compared to some of the other layers I've been doing too. So just going on in with it. Going on in with color. So just going in with more. More, basically is the motto of this style of painting. Okay, I'm gonna close this gap up, make this a little less intense. And with this last layer, you can really break up the space a little bit more, soften some transitions if you want, or if you feel like there's too much brightness coming through, you just go on in with more paint. Thicken it up. Make some of those lighter areas less bright. Again, softening those edges. Always softening those edges with a space painting. Always, always, always. So when I was a kid, fascinated by the background paintings of any like animated film ever. So like any Disney film, Snow White, Anastasia, and just like being in awe of like how did they get those colors to do that, and how did that move, and how are you getting that like ray of light and the color balance and the moonlight. And this is when I'm like 5, so I've always been a little obsessed with like this kind of painting anyway. And I always wanted to do background artwork for films and stuff too, because even until recently, like even up until the 90s, most backgrounds in films were hand painted, especially for like fairy tale type things, or if you for like some kind of B movies and stuff from the 50s and the 60s. Like most of those backgrounds were hand painted because they couldn't necessarily fly to location all the time and film on set. So like I've always loved backgrounds of paintings and films. So even to this day, when I'm watching a movie or an animated series or something, I'm like super hyper focused on the background more so than what's actually happening in the movie. Not always, but you know, depends on the writing. So I'm just kind of playing around with that a little bit more, softening up some areas. There's a lot of paint still here. I'm gonna go in with a lightly wet brush here. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Soften that area up. Okay. There's a couple areas on here where I can tell that I put a little more paint on than maybe necessary, so I'm just kind of moving my brush around a little bit more into those areas to smooth it out and let it blend into each other a little bit more. All right. Now, round 3. Okay, so for the next step, which is adding the stars and the spots and things like that, you need either a like an acrylic ink or a white gouache or like a white acrylic paint. Either of those will work great. And I use a toothbrush to make my star splatters because it's really easy. You can use your brush if you don't have one, and you just kind of do a tapping method. I'm going to demonstrate both of those with both kinds of paint. So the white ink is a little bit of a thinner liquid, so it's going to spread a little nicer. The gouache is a little bit of a thicker paint and pigment, so we're going to play around with that. Let me grab something I can put a little bit of that in. So I'm just going to use the lid of this little tin here to demonstrate the gouache versus the acrylic paint, or the acrylic ink rather. So with this, it's a little bit thicker. It's a lot like watercolor in composition compared to other paints, and I'm gonna water it down a little bit. I kind of keep a spray bottle on hand a lot when I paint, just in case I need it for different effects. I'm just gonna mix that in, really make sure it's mixed really well, and it's a little bit thinned out. You can already tell that that's a much thicker and more opaque paint type compared to watercolor, traditional watercolor. So here we go. Already got a drop on there. So what you're gonna do is, if you are using a brush, you're gonna kind of just tap it on your hand, and then you can get some nice drops going. And if you have a brush, you can kind of get more motion with it, and you're just gonna get paint on your toothbrush like this. And I always pull the bristles towards me and then let them go, and that you get a lot more splatter. If there's a little bit of a big drip right there, I'm not too worried about that. And you can do as much or as little as you want. So say you want one or two, like just really light spraying, you'd hold the brush back a lot further away and you get little tiny dots. If you get closer, you're going to get bigger dots as well. And you would use the exact same technique with the ink as well. So I haven't used this bottle in a really long time, so we'll see if I can get it open. I've had this bottle of ink for a really long time too. Like, I don't use it super regularly. I'm just going to rinse off the toothbrush. I prefer to do the gouache with my actual paintbrushes versus the toothbrush, just because the acrylic is a little bit more of a permanent paint on my type of brushes, and I don't necessarily want it to stay forever. So with the acrylic ink, kind of a similar idea. It's a little bit of a finer mist, just because it is a thinner pigment than the gouache. And I'm just going and adding a ton of little splatters. Really nice and little. And then what you can do is go in, If you want, you can always do actual constellations. Go in with like a really small fine brush, load up your gouache, and just do very precise dots and make them a little bit bigger. And you can make them like giant droplets if you need to, or you can just do little tiny ones. And I like to do those in a couple different areas. But you could do like an actual constellation if you so chose. Boop, boop. But that's just a neat way to do a nice galaxy painting. I'll let the dots dry, but I'm just gonna peel the tape off because it's very satisfying. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll be doing more tutorials like this in the future. I'm going to talk about creating texture in painting later, as well as other types of watercolor techniques. I mean, really, it's a good time to learn, especially when we're supposed to be practicing social distancing. We might as well learn some new tricks while we're at it. So there we go, a nice galaxy watercolor painting here. If you want, I do have prints of my whale watercolor on my website at holliskitchen.com, and it's KITCHIN. I have a link in the description below as well. But there you go. Enjoy, happy painting, and I'll see you next time. Bye!